Hey class, how you doing? We're trying a new background today, trying something new. This is the first of two lectures for Tuesday, May 5th. There will be two for today. We'll see how long they go. So we're going to pick up the story in the 1840s, and there's another theme that I need to layer in before we return to the discussion of politics and slavery and eventually the destruction almost of the country, all that good fun stuff. So the big topic for today, especially the first half of this lecture, is going to be immigration. So it's worth pointing out, of course, at the start that this is a nation of immigrants. With the exception of the Native Americans, everyone living here has some sort of immigration background, whether one's background is through slavery, where those are forced immigration, or other people who chose to come here. And in the very early days of the United States, basically the theme of immigration was come one, come all. Most immigration rules were very lax. The United States really encouraged immigration because it was a large country on the map, but underpopulated, comparatively speaking, and was trying to get as many people to come here as possible. So as a result, the early days of the United States, immigration was something that was very strongly encouraged. But if you stop and look at what the United States looked like, as early as the first decade or so of the 1800s, this was a very homogeneous country. Most people had a lot of the same things in common. So even though immigration was something that was occurring, it didn't lead to the kind of variety that we're pretty used to today. So if you look at the census of 1810, and we do a census every 10 years, we're doing one now to try to find out sort of what we know about the country. So one of the things that comes out of that is just how homogeneous the country really was in the few decades after the first generation after the American Revolution. So in that census, it's clear that over 90% of all Americans have some sort of background connected to the British Isles. So whether that's English, Scottish, or Welsh, that is by far the ethnic majority. Culturally, also not diverse in religion, because about 90% or so of Americans were Protestants. So Christians, although not all Protestants are the same, of course, but still had that religious background in common. And it's worth pointing out as well, if you look at that same census in the early 1800s, that most people lived very similarly. So by far the majority, again, 90% or so of all Americans lived in rural areas, which means that they were farmers or that they lived in farming communities. So you have a country that was essentially a bunch of people who all looked and prayed in very similar ways, worked in very similar ways. And then the story of the rest of the 19th century is going to be the ways in which the country changed. But change is not easy, especially for a place where people are used to thinking and living and working a particular way. When those changes start to happen, people are going to resist, and it's not that sort of change is not always going to be easy. As I said, the U.S. immigration policy in the early days was very, very open, but immigration numbers were pretty small. First couple decades of the 1800s, you're looking at only about 5,000 immigrants per year. In the 1820s, that went up to 10, maybe 20,000 a year. In the 1830s through the mid 1840s, it went up to 50,000 or so immigrants a year, still relatively small numbers, and numbers of people who did not have a dramatic effect on the overall population of the country. But that really changed dramatically starting in the mid 1840s. In the 10-year period from 1845 to 1854, almost 3 million immigrants arrived in the United States. Given that the population of the country at the time was about 20 million people, for 3 million people to show up, you can just imagine what a huge change that was, because suddenly the country is whatever that was, like 16% larger or something like that. That's a huge number of people simply to find homes for and jobs for, to make sure that there is a place for them in this country. That is a huge change. And in the history of the country, we've never had a 10-year period like that. Remarkable in many ways, and difficult for people on both sides of that, the immigrants themselves and the people living here already. So that 10-year period is one we're going to have to try to grapple with as we see what it was like for the immigrants as well as what it was like when they arrived here. First question, of course, is who these immigrants were. And as historians look at immigration, they look at two things as they're trying to talk about the history of immigration, why it happens, and where it happens. One thing is what's called push factors. Those are the things that are pushing somebody or pushing a group of people out of wherever they have originally been. And those will vary from time to time. They tend to be historically contingent. The pull factors are the things that pull people toward their final destination, or at least where they're trying to get to. And those are fairly consistent throughout American history. People who come to the United States from other countries today and in the 20th century and in the 19th century were coming for very similar reasons. Some of those are political, because the United States has historically a sense of more rights for the people, dating back to the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. That openness of American society has led people to want to come to the United States because it seems as if it is a freer country and therefore people have more opportunities here. And then the other one is economic. This has historically been a place that has drawn immigrants from other parts of the world because of the sense that there are economic opportunities here. Those would be defined differently in different eras. In the 17 and 1800s, people who are coming here are coming because it seemed as if there was land available, and that was the economic opportunity. But that began to transition in the later 19th century and through the 20th century when the United States became a place of economic opportunity because the standard of living was high, jobs are available, and it appeared as if this was a land of possibility in terms of what one's economic status could be that way. And if you talk to people who are coming to the United States in recent years, or if you yourself are of that background, some combination of those things are still pretty consistent in the story of why people choose the United States as a place to come to. So really, as we're talking through history, a lot of what we're looking at is those push factors, the things that are leading some folks to want to or to feel that they have no choice but to leave the place of origin. In this 10-year period, this remarkable 10-year period of dramatically increased immigration, there were two major immigrant groups that arrived in that period in large numbers. One are people coming from Ireland, and then the other are a set of people who are coming from what is today the country of Germany, although it wasn't a unified country at the time. So I'm going to call them the people from the Germanic states because they all have Germany as a language, German as a language in common. Starting with the Irish. The Irish, whom I've alluded to previously in the context of the British Empire previously, Ireland had been dominated by the British for centuries at this point. And as a result, Ireland's standard of living was very low. Most of the Irish were farmers living on land that they did not control themselves. Either they are tenant farmers for some of the wealthy Irish people, or more likely, they are tenant farmers living on land owned by British people. In either case, they're living on very small plots of land. They have to pay high rents, and their opportunities for advancement are very limited. There's very little education, very few opportunities. And given that the farms were small, especially compared to the large populations of these families, and the rents were very high, and the only way that the farmers in Ireland could pay those rents was through the crops that they grew. The result was that Irish farmers tended to grow very little food for themselves on the plot of land where their families lived, because most of the land had to be turned over to crops that they could sell to pay for the rent so they could continue to live on that land. And so the result was that over the centuries, Irish tenant farmers had wound up focusing almost entirely on one staple crop as the food crop that they would grow on the plot of land where their families lived, and that was the potato. Potato, of course, doesn't originate in Ireland. It actually goes back to the Columbian Exchange. It's one of those items that originated over here in the Western Hemisphere, but was brought back to the Old World in the decades and centuries after Columbus began that exchange of biology. And then the Irish in particular emphasize the potato because it does provide the basis for some sustainable life. It's a starch that you can work a meal around and live off of. And it also is relatively easy to grow and to continue to grow on the same plot of land because, unlike other kinds of crops, it doesn't require a lot of extra fertilizer. It doesn't do terrible things to the soil. You can plant the potato over and over again. The problem with focusing all of your food stuff on one item is what happens if something goes wrong with that item. And that's what happened to the Irish potatoes in the mid 1840s. Starting in 1845 and lasting for the next few years, a terrible event called the Irish potato famine took place, where the Irish potato crops were attacked by a pest that just worked its way, just damaged with tremendous ravaging the Irish potato crops all over the island. So in 1845, about a quarter of the Irish potato crop essentially failed. Pull the potato out of the ground, and it has just shriveled up and been eaten away by this pest. In 1846, about half of the Irish potato crop failed, and in 1847, the worst year of the potato famine, referred to in Irish history as Black 47, the most horrible year in Irish history, that year essentially there was no potatoes to be had. And given that that was the food that these poor Irish farmers were relying on to eat, the result in the mid 1840s was simply starvation because families wound up with nothing to eat, nothing at all to eat. They had no reserves, no money to speak of, and still their landlords are demanding rent be paid. The English, who had control over Ireland at this time politically, could have provided more support for the poor Irish peasants than they did. But in the end, what the leaders of England essentially decided to do was cut their losses and encourage the Irish to get out of Ireland if they could, many of whom could not. It's estimated that at least 1 million Irish people literally starved to death during the Irish potato famine starting in 1845. That number may even be higher. And then as many others as could got out of Ireland before starvation took them over. And they don't have any money. They have essentially no education. These are people who have been, they have a grade school education. They've been farmers all their lives, and that's what they expect to be. And maybe they could scrape together the price of a ticket to get on some sort of a ship going wherever. Some of them wound up in England, some of them wound up in mainland of Europe, but a lot of them wound up on ships that were coming across the Atlantic and came in large numbers to the United States because there was so much transatlantic shipping that they could get onto those ships, and in other cases, other scattered parts of the Western Hemisphere. But more than 1 million Irish people arrived in the United States as they're fleeing the starvation of the Irish potato famine. They're coming in large family groups. They have essentially no education and no job skills other than what they know from back home, which is how to raise crops on these small farms that weren't going to be available to them here in the New World. They had to find a place to live and find a means of living as soon as they arrived because they had no savings with them at all. And so the result was that there's a huge expansion of the Irish community in the East Coast cities, the port cities where these ships arrived. So because as soon as they arrived, they needed to find a place to live. They need to find jobs. They need to begin to not starve to death. So New York City, Boston, Philadelphia, and then some of the other smaller port cities along the East Coast saw a huge number of Irish immigrants who arrived, and essentially for the next probably 75 years or so, became one of the dominant groups in those cities as those early immigrants and then their descendants over the next few generations became vitally important to the population of those cities, making them expand dramatically. But again, they're coming with limited job skills. Many of the Irish people, some of them don't even speak English because they speak Gaelic. Almost none of them can read or write. And the kinds of jobs and the kind of work that they're going to do, especially at first, but in many cases through the first generation, are going to be basically the most unskilled and therefore the least well paid. So for the Irish, this was a difficult time. And they're arriving in huge numbers, not always well treated when they arrive, to put it mildly. Before we talk about sort of what happens when they get here, let's talk about this other immigrant group that did arrive in large numbers. The Irish are the most well-known of the immigrant groups of this big period because of the terrible drama that they're being chased out of Ireland as a result of. Actually, in the second part of this big wave, there actually were more Germans arriving as the first wave of Irish immigration began to fade off. Um, the Germans are coming from what today is the country of Germany, but at the time was a bunch of different independent nations that all had a shared culture and a shared language, dating back to the Holy Roman Empire and way, way back hundreds of years. So the Germans are coming for a completely different set of circumstances. Again, a lot of these people were farmers, like the Irish farmers. But what's happening in the Germanic states that led German farmers to come here is a little bit of a different story. Because the Industrial Revolution, which I've alluded to previously, had just begun to get in around this time, just begun to get to that part of the continent of Europe. What had started in England had spread in the early decades of the 1800s over to places like France and what would eventually be Germany and so forth. German farmers were involved in the early phases of the Industrial Revolution, but it was not a major part of their livelihoods. Most of the farmers in the rural areas of the different Germanic states would work in the factories that got opened up sort of as part-time work to provide themselves a little bit extra to get them over the top. Because as we've been discussing, it's tough, it's difficult being a farmer. Most farmers really don't have any savings, and so the possibility of getting some work during the winter months when there isn't any farming work to do, that helped a lot of farmers and helped their families. But economics began to change the story for these German farmers. As the German economy became more and more focused on manufacturing, the farmers who previously had worked in these factories as a part-time gig began to realize that they were going to have to choose that as full-time occupations, or they're going to have to give up their farms. And therefore, this change of industrialization that's going on led a lot of the farmers of the Germanic states to decide they wanted to get away from manufacturing and away from this wave of industrialization before their economic status declined too much, because that was clearly what was beginning to happen. So, a small number of German immigrants began to come over to the United States looking for places where they could continue to farm the way traditionally they had. And when they were successful, they then wrote back to their families and their neighbors, and that initiated a wave that then spread throughout the Germanic states throughout the 1850s, as ultimately more than 1 million German farmers and their families came over to the United States looking for a place where they could replicate what they traditionally had had. Their goal is to not stay in those same cities that the Irish were in, but instead to move farther inland and establish themselves as independent farmers in the Midwest and other farming regions. In some cases, the Germans are able to get to those regions. In other cases, they ran out of money before they could get there. So there was a large German population in those East Coast cities because some of the German farmers ran out of money. It's expensive to travel across the Atlantic, and so some of them wound up in the same communities and working the same sorts of jobs as the more desperate Irish immigrants were. And in other cases, they got farther inland, but then still wound up in some of the inland cities. So Milwaukee or Chicago or Cleveland, places like that. And then eventually, a significant number of the German immigrants made it all the way to the rural hinterland. And there are significant numbers of German immigrants who got to places like Minnesota and the Dakotas and other parts of the rural Midwest where they did establish themselves as farmers. So that wave splashes a little bit farther through North America, whereas the Irish wave essentially crashed along the shore and then stayed there for at least the next generation. Now, the process of immigration in those days was miserable. Immigrants today, for the most part, are able to come to the United States with at least some possibility of being welcomed or whatever, because most people who are coming to the U.S. today are getting on a plane or maybe driving across the border if they're lucky. Um, but that process is something that had not really been created at all as immigration begins in these huge numbers in the mid 1840s and thereafter. The shipping companies were not in any way prepared to bring ultimately 3 million people in a 10-year period across the Atlantic. And so essentially what happened was the businesses that already were taking ships back and forth across the Atlantic, then just tried to squeeze as many people as they could into those same ships. And so immigrants got squeezed down into the holds, down into the lower part of the ships, squeezed together in very inhumane conditions. Many of them got sick along the way. There wasn't enough food. There were people who starved to death. Sickness spread rapidly because of the poor living conditions. And then they arrive in the United States very much worse for wear, and then they're greeted by difficult living conditions and a lot of skepticism about their arrival. That's particularly true for the immigrants who wound up in the cities. As I said, almost all the Irish immigrants wound up in the cities where they first landed. So if you're on a ship that's going to Boston, those Irish immigrants generally stayed in Boston. If you're on a ship that's going to New York, those Irish immigrants basically wound up in New York, and likewise for Philadelphia and the other smaller East Coast cities. Um, the kinds of living conditions that they can get are going to be very poor indeed. What basically wound up happening is that the poor immigrants who are arriving, the poor Irish, and then the less well off of the German immigrants, they wound up crowded together in living conditions, usually in the older parts of the city, that some of the earlier residents had tried to get out of as living conditions began to decline. And the immigrants, mostly Irish, and then some of the German immigrants, wind up in what are called tenements, which are essentially very poor quality apartment buildings. Mostly what's happened is older single family homes get subdivided into a bunch of smaller apartments, and then families get pushed into them. There's hygiene is very poor. There's not enough running water. All sorts of terrible things are going on in terms of just the pure living conditions that most of the immigrants are living in, and they're just crushed together in incredibly intense living conditions in some of the older neighborhoods of cities like New York and Philadelphia and Boston. Um, People who come to those neighborhoods are always baffled and amazed and really kind of saddened by the living conditions that they see. Those living conditions essentially are thrust upon them by the circumstances of their arrival, and then by the fact that in many cases this is the only place where the immigrants were able to live because it was the only place where rents were available that they could afford, or where they could get to work in the jobs that they're able to get. So, what starts to happen in the same period that immigration takes off in huge numbers, is that also cities take off in huge numbers. And these two things work together. The immigrants wind up staying in places where they can get jobs, and factories tend to wind up in places where there are workers who will work for them, where there's a large population of possible employees. And so, which is the chicken and which is the egg, I will let others outside of my pay grade figure out. But certainly, those two things played a complementary role. Factory owners and capitalists in the early industrial period wind up siting their factories in places where they know they can find cheap labor because they're trying to keep their costs down. And so there are many factories in New York City and Boston and Philadelphia and the interior cities where other immigrants wound up coming to. Those factories typically wind up within walking distance of the crowded neighborhoods that the immigrants wind up living in, because they are cheap labor. They're desperate for jobs. They're poorly educated in most cases. Some of the Germans are better educated than most of the Irish are, but still, their options are limited. They have linguistic barriers to entry to jobs, and just generally don't have the job skills available to them to be able to find something other than these factory jobs that are there. And then the immigrants are going to wind up in those communities because that is where the jobs are. Those are the jobs that they can do. Those are the jobs that they can be hired to do. Um, and so those two things played into each other. So as the Industrial Revolution begins to take off, and as immigration begins to take off, those two things play a mutually reinforcing role. And so in this era, the cities, the urban places of the country, especially in the eastern part of the country, began to expand dramatically. The US, as late as 1820, had only one city with a population over 100,000, which was New York. And there are only two other cities in 1820 with a population over 50,000, which were Baltimore and Philadelphia. But by the census of 1860, New York City was at over 800,000 and was coming close to a million. And in 1860, there were 8 cities in the United States larger than the biggest city 40 years earlier. So cities are growing exponentially. They're doubling and doubling and doubling again in just a few short decades, crowding people into places that are really not prepared for this huge number, this huge influx of new people. Many of them immigrants, many of them in the working class, many of them working in these new factories, many of them crowded together into some of the neighborhoods with the poorest living conditions where there are unsanitary living conditions, where the health problems, there's crime and other social ills. All those things are happening in the cities, but also that's where the jobs are. And that's where the real growth of this part of the country is. Industrialization and immigration together help reinforce urbanization as the US begins to grow its cities, which is not a comfortable thing for a lot of people who were used to a country that was, in the early part of the 1800s, was largely a rural country and largely people who looked the way everyone kind of expected them to back in the day. So, immigrants are arriving in huge numbers. Immigrants are living in these big cities. The cities themselves are growing. There are social ills that are happening there. All of those things together helped reinforce a backlash against the immigrants that you begin to see as the number of immigrants arrived. And I have to say that I believe that given that this was the first major wave of immigration, and not the last, there will be another one about 50 years later in the end of the 1800s and the early 20th century. And then there is, of course, a more recent wave of immigration. But as this is the first one, this is the first time that the country has really had to grapple with what is it going to do when there are large numbers of immigrants? How are we going to deal with the economic consequences and the cultural consequences? And the result is that there are plenty of people who are living here already who change their minds very quickly about what immigration really meant for the country. Because there's a real backlash against the immigrants in the community that was here already, which I'm not really sure what we should call. Calling them the Americans seems a little dicey because everyone's an American as soon as they arrive. And calling them natives seems to imply that these people were here forever. But unless they're Native Americans who didn't really have any political say in this discussion, that doesn't really make sense either because the people here already, their roots are only a century or two at the most. And in some cases, these are people who have only been here for a few decades or a few generations. So not really sure the best way to describe them. Old line ethnics is what historians usually refer to them as. I'm not sure that that makes sense either because it doesn't really flow off the tongue. So we'll do our best here. But the folks living here already had mixed emotions at best about the arrival of the immigrants. There are a lot of them. There needs to be a place for them to live. The living conditions made other people concerned. Finding jobs for these immigrants was a concern. Of course, so many people arriving in such a short period of time. What are they all going to do in the country? All of those would have been concerns no matter what. Absolutely, unquestionably, would have led to some growing pains and some friction, and probably at least some of the people living here already having concerns that might have played out politically and culturally. Unquestionably, that would have been the case. But the nature of the immigrants who were arriving in this period exacerbated the negative response to the immigrants among many of the people who are here already. Because these immigrants look and sound and talk and pray and think and eat in so many different ways from the people here already that led to a big backlash against the immigrants for the first real time, a real anti-immigration sentiment. So, a term that is worth knowing, a term that's worth knowing probably to understand modern American politics, but also to understand the politics of the time period we're talking about in the 1840s and 50s, is a term called nativism. Nativism is a belief or really a feeling. I'm not sure it can be qualified as like a real true belief system, but a feeling that immigrants are bad for the country, that the United States is really for the people who are here already, and that immigrants, when they arrive, will undermine the life of the people who are here already. And therefore, people who are nativists are suspicious of immigrants. They may be beyond suspicious. They may have an outright hatred of immigrants. They may be convinced that the immigrants are going to destroy the country economically or undermine it politically. And therefore they want to do something to either stop the flow of immigration into the country or to limit the impact of immigrants once they do arrive. Nativism is a term that I think it's worth knowing so you can understand a lot of things. But certainly this response to the immigrants in the 1840s and 50s. So that nativism came from a bunch of places, not just the economic concerns and these other concerns, but also there's a strong religious aspect to the nativism that you see among the people here already in response to these immigrants. Because the immigrants arriving in the 1840s and 50s, they are Irish and they are German, which may not sound like they have much in common, but the one thing they mostly did have in common was that they were mostly Catholic. And they're arriving in a country that prior to their arrival had been almost completely Protestant. Now you'll remember these Protestant faiths, if you go back far enough to the 15 and 1600s, they had been created by people who broke away from the Catholic Church because they thought the Catholic Church was not doing Christianity the right way. And that sense that Catholicism has something wrong with it, that Catholicism is corrupt in some way, that the Catholic priests are corrupt leaders of a church that is inherently got problems with it. That sense is very strongly held within the hearts of many Protestants, even though they're all Christians and they all theoretically read the same Bible and worship the same God. Those rivalries, those religious rivalries that led to the creation of the Protestant faiths a few centuries earlier, they are still very, very strong and very much affected the response of the people here to these immigrants arriving with a different faith. The Puritans, you'll remember, they particularly hated the Catholics back in their day in the 1600s. There aren't any Puritans in New England anymore. When you get to the 1840s, they're long since gone. But the people in New England still culturally carry that baggage of anti-Catholicism, and there's a real anti-Catholic backlash that you see among many of the folks who are here already as these Catholic immigrants begin to arrive. Back in the colonial days, the Puritans hated Catholics so much that in most of those towns, they would have a celebration annually called Pope Day. And on Pope Day, they would make an effigy, a dummy of the Pope, who's the leader of the Catholic Church, who they despised as almost like the Antichrist. They would make that dummy of the effigy of the Pope, and they would put him on a cart, and then they would sort of take him through town while people threw things at him, threw Rotten Tomatoes and things like that. And then at the end of this hoo-ha, when everybody is running around and screaming and yelling at the effigy of the Pope, then they would take him to the town square, and then they would hang him by his neck from a tree and then light him on fire. And that was a party. That was something that people used to do in the Puritan villages in the colonial days. Well, Pope Day had faded away by the early 1800s. It's not celebrated anywhere in any of these New England villages, but it's not that long ago in the past. And there are real fears and deep hatreds of Catholicism that Protestants in the more religious areas of the country do feel. And remember, these immigrants are arriving at a time of expanded Christianity as the Second Great Awakening fanned the flames of Christianity among the Protestant faiths that were here. And so that clash, that religious clash, the timing for these immigrants arriving is not good. So that anti-Catholicism is very, very strong in the response that the immigrants faced as they're arriving here and just trying to make lives for themselves. Now, there's other reasons why there is a big nativist response to the immigrants as they arrived. Another thing has to do with just the way the immigrants lived. As I said, the immigrants wind up in cities, and in particular in the poorest areas, in the neighborhoods where living conditions are very poor, crime rates began to raise, there was more need for social services or for people who are in poverty and so forth, all of which led to a culture clash and a real cultural backlash against the immigrants. This plays out in any number of ways. I talked previously about what was going on with gender. Most of the immigrants, almost all of them, wind up not able to live out the ideals of the separate spheres and the cult of domesticity. The Irish immigrants, many of the German immigrants, when they arrived, their wives had to find work because they're entering that working class where if both the husband and wife don't have work, then there simply isn't going to be enough food on the table. Or the family units were undermined by their economic situation or the tragedies sometimes that occurred during immigration, and therefore women were the sole breadwinner, maybe the only one in the house, the only adult in the house, and therefore they had to work. So, as part of the clash that's going on here, working class women are doing jobs that middle and upper class women of the established classes believe is culturally wrong. And as you see church groups coming to talk to the working class women in their homes, much of what's going on there is Protestant women trying to tell Catholic women, richer middle class women trying to tell working class women, you are not true women. There's something wrong with you. You shouldn't be working. And the working class women saying, well, you just don't understand our lives. You don't understand how tough we have it. And also, we have money. We're not paid that well, but at least we have cash. We can make our own decisions. You guys have to just settle for whatever cash your husbands give you. And that's part of what's going on in this culture clash. More broadly speaking, there is a very deep anti-urban sentiment in the history of this country that I still see today playing out even in our current crisis. From the earliest days, many of the early leaders of this country believed that the United States would only succeed if it stayed a rural country. If you remember, Thomas Jefferson's goal was a country that was focused on the farmer. He thought the republic would only really succeed if individual family farmers were really the backbone of the country, because then they could make their own decisions. They wouldn't have anybody else telling them what to do or who to vote for or whatever. Well, therefore, Jefferson was convinced, and many others in the early founders of the country were convinced that rural places were the ideal places for the US and that urban places, there was something wrong with them. There's something inherently corrupt or something inherently un-American about the urban places that seem a little bit too European, that seem a little bit too prone to political or economic or cultural problems. As far as Jefferson and the other early founders of the country were concerned, Europe's problems could be summed up by looking at the social ills of a place like Manchester or a place like Birmingham, England. And that the cultural conflicts there and the class conflicts there, the US could never let those happen here, or else we would fall apart. And for that and many other reasons, there's a long-standing anti-urban cultural feeling, a sentiment that many people still to this day feel suspicion or fear when they think of urban places. They think of crime, they think of cultural chaos, they think of people crowded together, they think of all kind of disease, any number of things that too many people think when they think of urban places, as opposed to thinking of cities as a place of cosmopolitanism, a place of culture, a place where life is exciting, a place that's sort of on the leading edge in arts and intellectual thinking, which is the way other people would go. Most Americans in the early days of the country, and many Americans as these cities are opening up, look at the growth of these cities with incredible distaste. They're convinced that something terrible is happening to the country. If the cities are growing, then the country is declining. And the reason the cities are growing is because these immigrants are arriving and living in these terrible conditions. How could anybody live like that? And so that's part of this backlash against the immigrants. Many of the old line ethnics, many of the folks here already, looked at the immigrant neighborhoods and said, clearly what's happening here is these immigrants are not trying to become American. They're all living together. They're all speaking the same language. They're all eating the same food. They're all telling the same jokes and going to the same festivals or watching the same kind of plays that they used to watch back home. They're even praying the same way that they used to back home. As far as the folks living here already who objected to the immigrants, they felt that the immigrants were not trying to assimilate. They felt the immigrants were living in a way that would make them not like Americans. Now, the immigrants, for their part, they are doing their best in a bad situation to make the best of it. They would have been happy to live places that were less crowded, where the living conditions are better, where jobs are more plentiful, and so forth. But since they were forced into the poorest neighborhoods with these working class jobs and the factories where they're not paid that well, it's not surprising that then they held on to as much of their culture as they could. I mean, that's a perfectly human and understandable thing to do, and identified themselves as Irish or as German or the same way other future generations of immigrants would do, and would continue to do for generations thereafter, even as second and third generation immigrants identify more as Americans, they still identify with their ethnic background. That's not surprising. That's not in any way troubling, but it was troubling for the people who saw and lived through it for the first time, who didn't know what was going to happen in the long run and didn't have the modern sense that we have of multiculturalism and the sense that new people arriving can provide new ideas, new culture, make things more exciting, enrich everything. Those ideas just simply aren't part of the story. Instead, this culture clash that really drives a lot of the nativism of the time, this culture class on the part of the people here already, they were just convinced that the immigrants are going to destroy the country, and that was just their bottom line. All right, that culture clash plays out in a couple of the big, most emotional issues of the 1840s and 50s, things that are coming out of the Second Great Awakening, which again I will emphasize were Protestant ideas. And so these immigrants are not going to have the same response to some of the Second Great Awakening reform movements that many of the folks here already did. So, one of them is temperance reform. I mentioned already that the temperance reform movement came out of the Second Great Awakening, came out of the Protestant churches, and by the time you get to things like the Maine Law in the early 1850s, as temperance began to shift over into really prohibition, there was a big backlash against that, and that backlash was largely in the cities where the immigrants are beginning to show up in large numbers. Because whether they are Irish immigrants or German immigrants, both of those groups brought with them cultural beliefs that were centered in some cases around drinking as sort of a mutual way for the community to kind of work together. So there's a cultural predisposition to support the idea of drinking as sort of a healthy thing to do in a culture that the Irish and the Germans brought with them. And the Germans have beer gardens in the communities that they create, and the Irish have Irish whiskey and saloons that are based around that sort of social drinking. All of that is happening. And again, not surprising that people are going to hold on to the ideas they brought with them. But the Protestant temperance reformers saw these Irish immigrants and these German immigrants and the way they were drinking and the way they didn't seem to be changing when they arrived in a country that was having a temperance reform movement. And that led to, again, some of this clash of cultures. As the immigrants are arriving and the laws are attempted to be passed by temperance reformers like the Maine Law, this is going to make them even more firmly opposed to anyone who is going to try to sort of impose their own morality upon them. And then the immigrants had strong reasons to oppose the abolitionists. For many of the same reasons that I talked about previously, the working class in general was fearful of the abolitionists, partly because they're not well educated and therefore not able to accept some of the cultural ideas that the abolitionists are predicated on. So there's a deep-rooted sense of racism that is going to be hard to dislodge among anybody, but especially not among people who are not well educated. Um, but also there are economic reasons why plenty of these immigrants are just convinced that the abolitionists are out to wreck them. The Irish immigrants almost completely, and German immigrants for the most part, wind up building up this working class whose lives are very tenuous, whose jobs don't pay very well, whose working conditions and living conditions are very poor. And then the abolitionists are saying to the country, we should free the slaves. And the working class, many of them are immigrants, the working class were convinced that if the abolitionists got what they wanted, then the slaves, once freed, would then take the jobs of all the white working class in these cities and force out either force them out of their jobs or force them to take jobs at a much cheaper rate because they assume that that's what their bosses would prefer. And again, that's not crazy for them to think, given what we know about how economic conditions are going and how employers are trying to make their labor costs as cheap as possible. A better solution might have been to try to figure out a way across the races to come up with some sort of solidarity, but that didn't happen. Instead, the anti-abolitionist riots that I talked about, remember, those are in the North. Most of the rioters, the people in the streets or in those theaters throwing things at the abolitionist speakers, terrorizing them and attacking them, most of them are working class people who were scared of the abolitionists and what they stood for, and taking out their anger on people who they thought were in some ways going to hurt their own minimal status. And because they're mostly working class, that means that they're mostly immigrants as well, because those two categories basically overlapped. So, those two major cultural and political movements of this time tended to further divide the immigrants from the people who are here already. You're going to have a larger percentage of the folks who are here already who were inspired by the Second Great Awakening because that is so strong in the Protestant churches, who are then going to push for temperance reform and even some of them get into abolitionism, whereas the immigrants are going to be completely turned off by anything connected to that. And that's part of the same clash of cultures, and the same sense among the people here already that the immigrants are creating problems or exacerbating problems that already exist. Well, this led to the immigrants making a quick decision about which political party they were going to be affiliated with. In those days, and the rules have changed over the years, but in the 19th century, it was pretty easy to get to vote as soon as you arrived in the country. As long as you were the right age and as long as you were a dude, you were able to register to vote almost as soon as you arrived, which means that the immigrants very quickly, because there's so many of them, had a large political voice and therefore are going to have a lot to say about the politics in this new country as soon as they arrived. Um, they have two choices when they arrive in the 1840s and into the early 1850s. They can be Democrats or they can be Whigs. Well, almost to a man. There are some German exceptions, but almost to a man, the immigrants wound up in the Democratic Party. And there's a bunch of reasons for that. One is that from Martin Van Buren on, the Democrats, as the economy began to change, the Democrats had reached out to the new working class and tried to bring them into their umbrella because the Democrats emphasized that they were the party of the working man, the party of the common man. And for that reason, there already was a structure in place in most of these cities to bring working class, to bring factory workers into the Democratic Party. And as the immigrants arrived, they became part of that stream of working class voters. But there also are these cultural reasons. Working class people are generally not going to vote for Whigs because the Whigs are really the party of the bosses. The Whigs are the party that speaks to economic development in a way that the working class and especially the immigrants are not going to be interested in. But they're really not going to be interested in the Whigs because the Whigs are really the party of the Second Great Awakening. The Whigs' strength was New England and New York and New Jersey and parts of the upper Midwest, places where the Second Great Awakening was very strong. The Second Great Awakening had a big political impact, and the Whigs were of the two parties the one that was you're more likely to see it in. Democrats are the party of limited government involvement in people's lives. They're the small government party in those days, and therefore Democrats did not go for the kinds of cultural laws or culturally based laws coming out of the Second Great Awakening. The Whigs were. The Whigs were the party that were more likely to support the laws that include some of these cultural ideas of the Second Great Awakening, including and especially temperance reform. The Whigs are very strongly in favor of temperance reform, and given that the working class Irish and German immigrants, when they arrived, were strongly objecting to laws like the Maine Law, if the Whigs are the party of that, then give me the Democrats. And so for all those reasons, almost all, there's a subset of German immigrants who are an exception, mostly the ones who moved out to the Midwest and whose lives are different. But for the most part, the urban immigrants, the working class immigrants who wind up in the big factory cities of the East Coast and a little bit farther inland, they wind up as Democrats and helped expand the Democratic Party and helped to continue to grow this big majority that should have made it almost unbeatable in those days. All of that led to a strong sense among the Democratic Party that the immigrants are a key part of their coalition. And as a result, a real strong sense among the Whigs that they just don't like the immigrants that much. Culturally, the Whigs are the more nativist of the two major parties of the time. They're more this party of the Second Great Awakening, so culturally opposed to some of the things that the nativists, that the immigrants believed. But also, they are the party that the immigrants aren't voting for. And so why would they want the immigrants to come? Why would they want the immigrants to be able to vote? Why would they want the country to accept immigrants in such large numbers? So this political version of the culture clash plays out in the politics of the time. And you're going to hear politicians say all kinds of terrible things about immigrant voters. Part of the fear or hatred of Catholicism was a fear or hatred of the priests, who it was believed by anti-Catholic nativists basically told their parishioners what to do. The Catholic Church has more rituals and more secrecy, especially if you're not involved in the church, than some of the Protestant faiths do, particularly the fact that there's this confession ritual where individual Catholics go into a private booth, and then on the other side of that booth there is a priest, and they're supposed to be talking about sin and damnation and how to make yourself a better person and how to get closer to God and what the rules are and what you should change about your life and so forth. That seemed to outsiders like a real opportunity for the priests to manipulate these Catholic voters, and nativists are convinced the Catholics are dumb. The nativists are convinced anybody dumb enough to be a Catholic could be just told what to do by their priests, because if they don't listen, then they're going to be told they're going to hell. So as far as the Whigs and other nativists were concerned, what really is happening here is you get about 3 million people showing up in the country in a short period of time. Half of them are guys, a little bit more than half of them are guys. They can all vote right away. Suddenly that's like 1 million plus new Democratic voters. And they're going to be told who to vote for by their priests, who are going to be told who they should tell their parishioners to vote for by the bishops, by the cardinals, by the Pope. Suddenly it looks like the Pope has suddenly taken over American politics. That's what the nativists are thinking. And for the Whigs, they are very upset that their party is on the losing end of this. And you're going to hear within the Whig Party a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment, as of the two parties, they are the ones who oppose the immigrants because the immigrants wind up more in the Democratic Party for these cultural reasons and for these other reasons. And so that plays a role in the politics of the time. And what could have happened, what could have shaken out, is that the Whigs could have wound up being the party they'd always been, which is the party of sort of economic development, the party that focuses more on big business, the more activist government party. And the Democrats could have been the small business party, the party of the working class, the party of the immigrants. And that could have been what was going to happen. But At this time, there was so much anti-immigrant sentiment that even the Whigs, who were pretty anti-immigrant, was not enough for some of the nativists of the time who just despised the immigrants, who feared the immigrants, who were convinced that the immigrants were going to destroy the country. And so an alternative anti-immigrant party got created and really hit a peak in the mid 1850s. And for a time, it looked like this other party was going to push away the Whigs and take over as the alternative to the Democrats. These guys officially are called the American Party, but their origins are in a secret society, a fraternal group called the Order of the Star Spangled Banner. And this was a fraternal organization like the other ones that I've talked about, except in this case, unlike, say, the Washingtonians, where these are a bunch of guys who agree not to drink, or the Masons or the Elks or whatever, who are people of sort of similar cultural background. In this case, the Order of the Star Spangled Banner was a secret society of people who are all Protestants. And the rule was you could only join this if you were a Protestant. They give themselves this patriotic name to emphasize that they believe that only true Americans are going to have the kind of background that they're looking for. Now, unlike other fraternal organizations, which were pretty open in their membership, the Order of the Star Spangled Banner, as it got started in 1850, was a secret society. And the rules were that you don't try to join them, they come find you. So if you're the sort of person who at the bar or at the workplace or out in the neighborhood is well known for saying things about, I hate the immigrants, I hate all these Catholics, I hate what they're doing to our country, then at some point, the Order of the Star Spangled Banner, whatever the local chapter is going to come knocking on your door and they're going to bring you to their meeting and they're going to invite you to join. The rules were that when you were asked to join, you had to swear an oath that you would not only support the ideas of the Order of the Star Spangled Banner, but not tell anybody else about it. At the oath, you had to swear that you would never vote for a Catholic, never work for a Catholic, and never hire a Catholic in a job that they had any control over. So the Order of the Star Spangled Banner was a very nativist and very anti-Catholic group. They got the nickname the Know-Nothings because of the secrecy. The idea was to try to give a sense that maybe they were bigger than they really were. Nobody was really supposed to talk about what they were doing, to give themselves kind of a mysterious sense. And if you knew somebody who you thought might be in the Order of the Star Spangled Banner, if you asked them about it, then they had been sworn to secrecy, and what they would say is, I know nothing about that, which eventually becomes kind of a running gag and would probably get a little bit old because, if constantly the person says, I know nothing about that, I know nothing about that, I know nothing about that, I don't know anything about that, I know nothing, then eventually people began referring to folks in this group as the know-nothings because that's what they said when asked about the group. Not a name that they officially took themselves, but that is what everyone refers to them as in this time. We don't really know how big the Know-Nothings got because, of course, they are a secret society. But our best guess is that between their founding in 1850 and their peak, which is around 1854, 1855, maybe 300,000 members, maybe more than that, joined different sections, different local chapters of the Order of the Star Spangled Banner, the Know-Nothings. And that's just how many people that the Know-Nothings found or that were willing to join this secret society. It gives you an idea of the real depth of nativist feeling and of just how much power that anger and hatred, really irrational in many ways, that there really was in response to the huge numbers of immigrants and how different they were. Well, with that kind of numbers and with that kind of power in many communities, it's really not a shock that the Order of the Star Spangled Banner, which was just a community group, which was just a local organization organized in different areas, that it then got into politics. So 1854 was their big breakthrough year. In 1854, they founded a political wing that's called the American Party to emphasize that they are not immigrants, that they don't like immigrants. And then they ran candidates for office, not a presidential year, so they're not running any presidents, but they instead sent people to run for county councils and for board of elections and for mayors, governors, congressmen, and they had a tremendous success. Not everybody who was in the American Party won that year, but many elections where they did put up a candidate, they had tremendous success, especially through New England and parts of the old Midwest and all the way through the Eastern Seaboard, maybe as far down as New Jersey. Huge success. Such lightning success, that it appeared in many ways that they were going to push aside the Whigs. And in fact, it appears that many people who used to vote for the Whigs, because now there's an alternative that was more opposed to immigration than even the Whigs, that led a lot of folks to vote for the American Party, the Know Nothing Party, in 1854. The other thing is the Whigs basically are fading away at this point. And so the Know Nothing's timing is very good. And so for a little while there, mid-1850s, and the moment is small as it turns out, but it looked like to political observers that a real political shift was happening in the country. Previously, it used to be Democrats versus Whigs. The Democrats are the Jackson Party. The Whigs are basically the Clay Party. The Democrats are the small government, the party of the common man, and the Whigs are a big government, focus on economic development, big business, and so forth. It looked like there's going to be a realignment because the Whigs had fallen on bad times, and now they're going to go away and be replaced as the alternative with the Know Nothings. And honestly, that could have been what happened, and maybe we'd still have that today. Democrats versus Know Nothings, I guess. Didn't happen that way. The story of the 1850s works out differently, but the Know Nothings had their chance in part because there's just so much hatred. There is just so much nativism, and they're tapping into that, but partly because the Whigs have pretty much fallen apart by the early 1850s. A lot of things working against the Whigs. It didn't help that they're so unsuccessful in the most important elections, which are presidential elections. In fact, during the period of time when the Whigs existed as a party, if the Whig Party came and knocked on your door and said, hey, we want you to run for president, we're the Whig Party, you slam your door in the face because that was a foolish thing to say yes to. The Whigs only successfully elected 2 presidents in their entire existence, and both of them died in office. The first one was William Henry Harrison. He was president for 6 weeks before he died, and then John Tyler took over and basically made everything crazy, and the Whigs almost fell apart as a result of his incompetence. Then the Whigs had another shot in 1848, in part because of the third-party candidacy of Martin Van Buren, which essentially really undermined the Democrats, his old party. The Whigs were able to sneak in another candidate successfully for president, Zachary Taylor, hero of a war that they didn't like that much, but whatever. But then Taylor also died in office, which is part of the reason why the Compromise of 1850, the last class, got passed, because he wasn't there to stop it. He gave a lot of speeches on the 4th of July in 1850, got really sick, came down with gastroenteritis, which is a terrible way to die, and essentially his stomach exploded a few days after that, which is a terrible way to go. And so the guy who took over and finished out his term is a sort of nobody from upstate New York named Millard Fillmore, who is unmemorable except for the fact that his name is Millard, and that's a pretty fun name. So the Whigs have not succeeded at the highest level in consolidating power because they only elected 2 presidents, and both times those guys died before they could do much. And then the vice presidents afterwards, it's hard for them to consolidate power. That doesn't help. It also doesn't help that the other major Whig leaders by the early 1850s are beginning to step off the stage. Henry Clay was basically the main idea man of the Whig Party. He died in 1852. Daniel Webster, the other leading Whig from New England, also died in 1852. And they weren't really generating new leadership who could help bring the Whigs to a new generation of Americans. Plus, the ideas that the Whigs stood for originally are much less relevant in the 1850s than they had been in the 1830s and 40s. The Whigs had stood for things like banks and tariffs, internal improvements, stuff like that. And honestly, those aren't the big issues that anyone's talking about that much as you get into the 1850s. In the 1850s, they're talking about temperance, and the Whigs have a position on that, but it's dangerous because there's plenty of people who dislike the idea of passing a Maine law. And the other issue is slavery. And honestly, the Whigs are not doing well on the issue of slavery, although they should be the more anti slavery party because they're the more northern party. The Whigs had a real tough time trying to get together on the slavery issue. And in fact, as you get into the 1850s, slavery is one of the things that begins to tear the Whigs apart. There were Southern Whigs. Whigs in the South tended to be from places where there isn't a lot of slavery. So the western parts of Virginia, for example, or the mountainous regions of Kentucky. Those are places where there were a bunch of Southern Whigs, but they still generally felt more positive towards slavery than most Northerners did. And so the Whigs kind of straddled the issue of slavery. Well, it turns out that even though it was Stephen Douglas, a Democrat, who helped push through the Compromise of 1850 at the end of the last class, the Whigs, because it was really their party's idea in the first place, they're the ones who got the blame in the years following when the Compromise of 1850 didn't look too good to the public as it was actually applied in the years following. The big issue for Northerners is the fugitive slave law, which hadn't really been a big part of the debate. Most of the debate was, what are we going to do with all that territory out west? That was the big issue. And Clay had put a stronger fugitive slave law into the Compromise of 1850 as a way to help balance things and keep the South happy. And then Douglas got that passed as he broke it down into parts. Well, the fugitive slave law was something that therefore was associated in the public mind with the Whigs. But as it turns out, especially in the North, the fugitive slave law was very divisive and made many Northerners turn against the Whigs for doing it, and even more broadly against slavery as you get into the 1850s and see how this turns out. So the idea of the fugitive slave law, which was an update on a previous much weaker version that had existed for decades, almost since the beginning of the country, the idea was that the government should be involved in helping slave owners get back their lost property, which in this case were human beings who had run away to the North. The North doesn't have slavery in their states, and so that's why slaves are going to run away there. But that's still part of the United States as a whole, and slave owners wanted the government to help them track down those slaves and bring them back. Previously, there had been laws existing that said the government should do that, but the law of 1850 really put some enforcement teeth into that. And once that law got passed, Southern slave owners and their representatives tried to use it as a way to track down and bring back slaves who had escaped. In some cases, who had been living as free people in the North for years. In one case, at least a couple of decades. Not necessarily because they expect to get labor from these former slaves, because in many cases they're older and their chance of really working as hard in the fields was going to be pretty limited. The real goal here is the slave owners want all the other slaves to not think that slaves can get away. They want to send a message. They want to make sure that the symbolic gesture here is important, and they want the government on their side, and now the government is on their side. So, in the early 1850s, in the years after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Law, representatives from slave owners and political representatives tied to them pushed the federal government to track down or follow rumors about the whereabouts of former slaves who had run away to the North. And in many cases, and there's dozens of instances of this, there were former slaves who were indeed tracked down. In some cases, the slave owners had a pretty good idea where the slaves were, former slaves, free people now. They had a pretty good idea where they had gotten to, but they hadn't been able to actually physically get them because going up to the North and literally kidnapping somebody back into slavery is not something that most people can do, thank goodness. Well, now with the government on their side, they have options. and therefore they pressured the government to help them in this process. Now, uh, you see circumstances where individual former slaves, people who got away to freedom, who've been living as free men and women in the North, sometimes, as I said, for over a decade, in one case, almost 2 decades, were arrested by local authorities and then, in some cases, held in prison or in federal custody until either the government shipped them back to the South or a representative working for a slave owner then came and brought them back into slavery in the South. And you can imagine what this, of course, would be like for the fugitive slave who thought that they had gotten away to freedom. But you can also, I think, imagine why this led some people in the North to get upset. Because slavery previously had been something that most people in the North didn't think that much about. Honestly, that's part of the reason why the abolitionists hadn't had a lot of success, is that slavery was something that was a Southern problem. Slavery was their problem. Slavery is a problem that the slaves down south, who most people in the North have never met or really thought much about, that they had to deal with. But now it turns out that there's people living in the North, and those people are going to be forced back into slavery. And when that happens, that's going to change the story. The big thing here is that the abolitionists, who knew that slavery was wrong, who knew that the fugitive slaves should be free, and who knew that the government, by choosing the side of the slave owners, was choosing the side of evil, the abolitionists did their best to make sure that every time a fugitive slave was captured and brought back into slavery, that everybody knew about it. The abolitionists' great strength is publicity. They have speakers and journalists, and they have a voice, and they use it. Everywhere that they found out that a fugitive slave had been taken into custody and was going to be brought back to the South, abolitionists came to that area in huge numbers, and they began to pray, and they began to speak publicly, and they wrote to their congressmen, and they tried to get articles in the local newspapers to make sure that everybody in the community got up in arms about this. And mostly they have limited ability to help the fugitive slaves. Often those fugitive slaves still wind up being brought back into the South, and we don't know for sure what happens to all of them, but it's not good. But what they're trying to do, and what they're very successful in doing, is getting other people in these communities to realize that the stuff they've been saying about slavery was true. And slavery was bad. And slavery is bad for everybody. That's what they're trying to talk about. One of the most well-known examples takes place in 1854. There was a former slave named Anthony Burns. He had been living as a free man in Boston for a period of time. Unfortunately, when he sent a letter back home, which is supposed to be transmitted secretly to his family to let them know that he had safely gotten to Boston, that letter was intercepted, and then the slave owner, his former owner, found out where Anthony Burns was. Boston is not a place where a white Southerner normally would be able to just sort of go and get a former slave back into slavery, because it's got a large free black population. It's the center of the Second Great Awakening and the center of abolitionism. But now this slave owner knows that he's got the whole government on his side. And so he got in touch with basically the U.S. Army, and the federal government arrested Anthony Burns, put him in the local jail in Boston, where he waits for a period of time for when the representative of his former owner is going to come and take him back to slavery. This is 1854, and at this point, the abolitionists have gotten very sophisticated in their methods to respond to when fugitive slaves got arrested. And so ultimately, maybe 50,000 abolitionists converged on the city of Boston. They briefly were talking about trying to actually break him out of the jail, but the federal government has guards, including people from the army, who were guarding the jail to make sure that they weren't going to be able to just burst him out. And so they went with Plan B, which was they surrounded the jail and they turned it into a days-long prayer service on behalf of Anthony Burns, where they prayed for his fate and they prayed for his soul and they prayed for his freedom. And ultimately, the whole city knew about Anthony Burns, and really the whole country did, because the period of time while they're waiting for the slave owners to come and get him was long enough that the stories then spread throughout the country And this became one of the big stories in the early part of 1854. Really, everybody all over the country knows about Anthony Burns and his terrible fate that's going to be awaiting him as he sits in the jail, feeling terrible despair, hearing the prayers outside the jail cell of the abolitionists, but knowing he can't get out and knowing that he is going to soon be brought back into slavery. Ultimately, representatives from the slave owner got to Boston, and then Anthony Burns was taken in manacles through the streets of Boston to the ship that is going to be brought back to the South and brought back into slavery on. And again, these thousands of abolitionists lined the streets along the route that Anthony Burns was taken, praying for his soul, praying passionately for some sort of release, for some sort of divine intervention, praying against slavery. Powerful, powerful moment that was discussed in newspapers all over the country. Now, Anthony Burns' story, unlike most of these other fugitive slaves, does have a happy ending because as he was on the ship on the way back to slavery and on the way back to a fate that would have been terrible, some wealthy abolitionists in Boston at the meantime had gotten in touch with representatives of the slave owner and offered to purchase his freedom. It appears that basically they thought that it was the least they could do because they had helped make him a cause celeb and therefore helped turn around a lot of people in the North, and they thought that, in his case, that they should intercede on his behalf. And so to his amazement, he arrived in the South at the port where his ship docked, and he was told he could go back to Boston as a free man because some of his wealthy allies had paid for his freedom. And so he went back and lived the rest of his life in Boston as a free man. Most of the other fugitive slaves were simply not that lucky and got brought back into slavery, and everything that slavery meant and then some was then perpetrated upon them. Now, when the abolitionists did this for Anthony Burns, or when they did this as much as they could for the other slaves that they found out had been captured and are going to be brought back to the South, what they were doing was helping to force Northern public opinion to choose a side. It's one thing to be, it's not my problem. It's one thing to be, well, that's for you guys, it's a Southern thing. It's not something we need to worry about. Most Northerners, most white Northerners, were fairly agnostic about the problem of slavery. They didn't really care that much about the slaves. They don't really care that much about slave owners. They don't really care that much about the issue because it's not their problem. But every time the abolitionists made it a big local story that someone who lives in your town, someone who maybe you work with or a friend of yours works with, or that goes to your church, or that you've seen at the bar, or that walks his dogs in your neighborhood, or that his kids and your kids know each other from school. Anytime that anything like that happens, the abolitionists hammered away at that locally, and it became a lot harder for people to think this doesn't have anything to do with me. Because slavery, it turns out, does have something to do with your neighborhood and my neighborhood and your town and my town. Because the power of slavery is reaching all the way from the South into your community and taking a member of your community back down to slavery. And you could not care about that in a general way, but to not care about that when slavery now has a face of someone in your town, that's harder to do. And the abolitionists also emphasize so much is on the side of the slave owner, and so little is on the side of the slave. Even the government is helping the slave owners. We're a country that really, really does like the underdog, and the slaves are clearly in the story the victims, and all the power of the country seems to be arrayed against them. Many people in the North found it much harder to be neutral on the issue of slavery, to say, well, it doesn't matter to me, it's not my problem. It is their problem. It's their problem because it's their town's problem, it's their community's problem, it's their neighbor's problem. And therefore it's their problem too. The way the fugitive slave law worked out and the way it was implemented and the way the abolitionists hammered away at that as a topic really, really strongly affected the point of view of a lot of people in the North who were deeply moved by what they saw and then turned their anger against the slave owners and against slavery in general, where previously maybe they just hadn't cared that much. So, if somebody of the two political parties is going to feel that anger, that rising anger against slavery and against the fugitive slave law, it turns out it's going to be the Whigs, because the Whigs are the party that implemented this and put it together and had tried to justify that as saying, well, we're trying to save the country. Well, as Northerners are feeling more and more opposed to slavery, then the Whigs are going to be the party they're going to take that out on. Democrats, they're a lost cause. The Democrats are so strongly tied into the politics of slavery in the South. Forget them. But the Whigs should have known better. And a lot of people in the North just really turned against the Whigs at a time when the Whigs are falling apart. The thing that really truly proves that the Whigs are just doomed is the election of 1852. In 1852, Millard Fillmore, who was the president who took over after Zachary Taylor, Millard Fillmore was the candidate of the more moderate Whigs, and the Southern Whigs. But in the end, the Whigs wound up nominating Winfield Scott, the other big hero of the Mexican-American War. The theory is, well, we won an election based on patriotism the last time. It wasn't our fault Zachary Taylor died. Winfield Scott was the other big hero of that war. That's the last big war that we had. Everybody was a big fan of how it worked out for us. So let's nominate that guy. Winfield Scott was kind of a compromise candidate because he is sort of a famous guy. A lot of Southerners aren't sure they can support him, though, because he makes clear that he's not so sure how he feels about the Compromise of 1850 or the Fugitive Slave Law. And then, to make matters worse, he made the nativists in his party very unhappy. Winfield Scott is actually smarter about politics than most of the politicians. Winfield Scott is recognizing that the country is changing politically, and if the Whigs are going to get anywhere, they need to get some votes from the immigrants. But what he did made all the nativists in his party very unhappy. So he gives a big public speech, and he had secretly planned to place in the crowd a German guy and an Irish guy. And at various times during his speech, they're going to raise their hand and they're going to say something. And so the German guy says something, and Winfield Scott says, "Oh, wow, it's great to hear somebody from Germany. Well, welcome to the country. We're so glad to have you. Welcome to America." And then later on, an Irish guy says something, and Winfield Scott says, "Wow, it's great to hear that Irish brogue. Welcome to the U.S. You guys, we're really glad to have you, vote for the Whigs." And after he gave that speech, which he thought was smart politics, then the nativists among the Whigs looked at him and said, "We don't want to vote for this guy. He seems like he likes immigrants." And, it seemed like smart politics to him, but it led many people to feel that this is just sort of a loser candidate. And in the end, the Democratic candidate, a guy who nobody had heard of, the Democrats, again, just to sort of make everybody in the party happy, their solution, which had worked previously, pick a guy who nobody has anything against. They nominated a nobody, a guy from New Hampshire named Franklin Pierce, who I tell you, outside of New Hampshire, no one had ever heard of before 1852. That guy, Franklin Pierce, who no one's ever heard of, who doesn't stand for anything, who is a Northern man with Southern convictions, that guy, Franklin Pierce, won every state but 4 in 1852. The Whig candidate, Winfield Scott, hero of the Mexican-American War, who should have the entire Whig apparatus behind him. The Whigs don't even want to support him because Southern Whigs don't think he's pro-slavery enough, and Northern Whigs don't think he's anti-immigrant enough. And he won 4 states. Franklin Pierce, a guy who no one's ever heard of, won all the rest. After that, basically the Whig party fell apart. They'd been in trouble anyway. But if they can't muster up better than 4 states in an election against a guy who has nothing going for him other than he's a Democrat, well then, why do they even exist? Essentially, the Whig Party fell away. At the same time that the anti-immigrant sentiment of the Know-Nothings coalesced behind the so-called American Party, and although they don't really get a chance to run somebody for president because of the timing here, that's why in 1854 the Know-Nothings did so well. Because they're appearing on the scene at the time when it looks like they can take the place of the Whigs as the Whigs fell away. Well, what that means really for the politics of the mid 1850s is that if you're a Democrat, it seems like this is the greatest time ever. The Democrats are convinced that this was going to be the era of good feelings again, that the Whigs were fading away and they don't really think that the Know Nothings are here to stay. And so, therefore, it looked to the Democrats like they were going to be the only show in town. And therefore, the Democrats in the mid 1850s wound up doing something that was pretty dumb because no one was there to stop them. And this is going to be the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Now, I take you to the Louisiana Purchase. Right? So if you remember all that land that Thomas Jefferson had bought from the French in 1803, and they had carved out some states from that already, including the state of Missouri, which led to that big brouhaha. In 1820, Henry Clay, the great compromiser, had come up with the Missouri Compromise, which passed through Congress. And the deal was that they drew a line through the Louisiana Purchase, that 3630 line. Everything in Louisiana Purchase south of that can have slavery, and everything in Louisiana Purchase north of that can't have slavery. And that's the plan. And as they organized territories, they organized them with no slavery north of that line and with slavery south of that line, and that's fine. Except that now, as you get into the 1850s, people are actually moving to those territories, and Southerners start to get worried about that deal. It was fine back in 1820 because it didn't sound like there were going to be that many people who wanted to move to those territories. But now it's the 1850s, and they figured out like that's good farmland, and indeed a lot of people do want to move to those territories. And Southerners are getting very worried that if a lot of people move into the northern part of the Louisiana Purchase, a lot more of that, and that could lead to a lot new anti-slavery states. And as far as the Southerners are concerned, they can't let that happen. They're going to try to stop that from happening as much as possible. They're trying to figure out a way to change that deal. The key guy in this story is a guy who I mentioned previously, a senator from Illinois named Stephen Douglas. Stephen Douglas doesn't care that much about slavery. Doesn't really matter that much to him. What Stephen Douglas is mostly focused on is his state of Illinois. The biggest city in Illinois is the growing city of Chicago, which in the 1850s is really just a speck, but seems like it's well positioned to become an important city if it can be connected. And what the real thing that Stephen Douglas is focused on is the railroad. Wants the transportation revolution to come through Chicago and to work its magic on Chicago and on that part of the Midwest the way it had in other parts of the country. The big thing is that the government, really, the federal government, really wants to construct a railroad from the center part of the country all the way out west. If nothing else, they want a railroad they can use to ship all the gold back. But it seems like the time has come for some sort of transcontinental railroad to help connect the eastern part of the country all the way out to the Pacific. So Stephen Douglas, of course, would like that railroad to go through the state of Illinois because that's going to make his state more powerful, more economically important, and especially to go through Chicago, which if there is a northern route, Chicago would be basically the endpoint for that. That's going to make Chicago probably almost as important to the country as New York because so much shipment would be coming through the city if they built that railroad. Stephen Douglas would like a railroad to go through Chicago. Therefore, he is strongly encouraging, as one of the most important senators in Congress in the 1850s, that the government get behind a route that would take the railroad through Illinois and straight shot across the Pacific. And Southerners don't want that at all. Because if there's a railroad that goes through Illinois and then a straight shot all the way to the Pacific, it's going to go through the Louisiana Purchase, through those territories that, if they get turned into states, won't have slavery. Well, if there's a railroad that goes through there, then people are going to wind up there in larger numbers, and that will accelerate the process of creating non-slave states. Southerners don't want that at all. Southerners want an alternate route. They have no problem with a railroad. They want a railroad that cuts across the South. And in fact, that's one of the reasons why after the Mexican-American War, not too long after, the U.S. purchased a section of land from Mexico that fills in the bottom of the current map of Arizona and New Mexico because the terrain there was good and it would be a good place for a railroad because it's nice and flat. So Southerners are looking for a southern railroad, Northerners, like Stephen Douglas, are looking for a northern railroad. And then there's a compromise suggestion that would sort of cut through the middle of the country. Southerners are digging in. They want the Southern Railroad only because a middle one or a northern one is going to go through the Louisiana Purchase and it's going to bring people to the Louisiana Purchase and wind up creating more non-slave states because that was the deal in the Missouri Compromise of 1820, and they don't want that to happen. And the longer they dig their heels, the more annoyed Stephen Douglas is because Douglas can't get the railroad that he wants to make Illinois important and Chicago important. And oh, by the way, make him a millionaire because he has all these investments in Illinois and Chicago that if Chicago turns into the big city that he thinks it's going to be, he's going to make a lot of cash. So this is important to him. He's in an important position in the Senate and therefore a guy to negotiate with. And then the Whigs basically disappeared, leaving him and the Democrats pretty much alone to negotiate amongst themselves. The two questions here are, where's the railroad going to be? What's going to happen to that territory? Seemed pretty clear. The rule of a generation earlier was stuff north of the 3630 line can't have slavery. Southerners then open up negotiations with Stephen Douglas. We might be willing to support the railroad that you want if we have a shot to get into that territory. Okay, let's talk. And ultimately, the discussion that worked out in 1854, Douglas proposed that they take the remainder of the Louisiana Purchase, the whole thing that they hadn't organized into territory yet. Some of it was states already, some of it was territories that had already been organized. But the rest of it, the kind of unplanned area that not many white folks had moved into yet, let's take that and let's divide that into two new territories. We'll call one Kansas, we'll call the other one Nebraska. If you look at the map, it's not exactly the modern day Nebraska, it's actually a bunch of other things. Kansas that he's calling on the map is basically the current Kansas. So let's make those territories actually set up now. Let's put territorial governments there, and let's let them decide if they want to have slavery. According to the Louisiana Purchase, according to the Missouri Compromise, they're not allowed to have slavery. What Douglas is proposing and what all the Southerners in Congress jump on board with right away is, well, let's repeal the Missouri Compromise. We don't need it anymore. Let's get rid of it. Let's allow the people living in Kansas and Nebraska, these two new territories, let's let them decide. And let's just overrule and get rid of the old Missouri Compromise. And so that's the legislation that he puts together. The entire reason why he's proposing this is because if Southerners get what they want on this, the chance to maybe have slavery in an area that they had previously been banned, then they'll go for his railroad. It's all part of the deal. Stephen Douglas's Kansas, Nebraska bill, controversial in the North, not surprisingly, passed through the Senate and passed through the House with all Southerners pretty much voting for it and enough Northern Democrats voting for it, either because they had political ties to the Southerners, like Douglas did, or because the president at the time, Franklin Pierce, a Northern Democrat with very pro-Southern leaning, pushed on them very hard and was able to use his political leverage, plus Douglas, who is a very adroit politician, were able to get the Kansas-Nebraska bill turned into a law when it passed the House and the Senate and the president signed it in 1854. Which means that now it is going to be possible for there to be slavery in parts of the country that previously had been agreed that there wouldn't. The Kansas-Nebraska Act makes the Southerners very happy because now they have a chance to expand. For the same reason, the Kansas-Nebraska Act made people in the North very, very unhappy. Because as far as they were concerned, the Missouri Compromise had been a sacred deal, a promise to them that slavery was not going to expand into that part of the country. And now the South seems like they're trying to get away with something. Popular sovereignty is going to be the rule in Kansas and Nebraska, so maybe there won't be slavery there. But the door is open to it, and Northerners are so angry at that door being opened that in the aftermath of the Kansas-Nebraska bill, and as it's turned into the Kansas-Nebraska Act, there is political outrage all over the North. There are people who march in protest. There are prayer meetings. There are politicians who vote for it, whose careers are utterly destroyed. And all over the North, the backlash against the Kansas-Nebraska Act is very, very strong. It turns out that one of the reasons why the Know-Nothings had the success they did in 1854, their big year in American politics, is not just because of nativism. Yes, a lot of people supported them in the local elections and congressional elections and so forth because they don't like immigrants, and the Know-Nothings don't like immigrants, but also because the Know-Nothings opposed the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The Know-Nothings said, we don't like this law, and therefore, if you're looking in 1854 for a way to fight against it or to speak out against it, then voting for the Know-Nothings made sense because the Whigs don't exist anymore. All the Democrats had supported it, and so a lot of people in the North voted for the Know-Nothings in 1854 because they thought that that was going to help oppose the Kansas-Nebraska Act. A year later, the Know-Nothings got together and revised their opinion on the Kansas-Nebraska Act. As the Whigs had disappeared, a bunch of Southern Whigs went into the Know-Nothings, and they said, you know, we would maybe be able to help you guys in the South, but we can't really get anywhere if we still have this anti-Kansas-Nebraska Act platform. And so in 1855, the Know-Nothings pulled that off their list of things that they stood for and essentially collapsed. Because Northerners, it turns out, they hate immigrants, a lot of them, but they really, really hate the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And it turns out that there's going to be an alternative that they can vote for that also opposes the Kansas-Nebraska Act more strongly. Because the same year, the Whigs are gone, the Know-Nothings have their brief moment, the incredible anger against the Kansas-Nebraska Act is happening all throughout the North. The same year that that's all happening, former Democrats, former Whigs, former Free Soilers got together in some northern states, the Midwestern states of Indiana, Illinois, and Ohio, and created a new political party called the Republican Party. And that, in its small local origins, is the beginning of the Republican Party that exists today. Created by Northerners who oppose the Kansas-Nebraska Act, they are essentially the heirs of the intellectual ideas of the Free Soilers and the Liberty Party, people who oppose slavery or at least oppose slavery from expanding, and also picked up on some of the old ideas of the Whigs and eventually some of the nativist ideas of the Know-Nothings, because as the Know-Nothings fell apart in the North, people drifted over to the Republican Party. The Republican Party is small but grows rapidly from its early days in 1854, in part because there's just so much anger in the North about the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Now, before we continue, let's just say we got one last thing to do for this topic. Let's just look at that new map of the Louisiana Purchase that's been created by this Kansas-Nebraska Act, a terrible, terrible law, politically a disaster, as it turns out, for the Democrats. Didn't help Stephen Douglas the way he wanted. But that's another story. Obviously, the Nebraska area, which turned into a bunch of other states later, that doesn't seem like a likely place for slavery to expand to. But Kansas borders Missouri, which is a slave state, and therefore seemed like a possibility for slavery to expand into in the immediate aftermath of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And therefore, Southerners tried to get into Kansas in large numbers, because the idea here is popular sovereignty. The people in the territory will decide if they want to have slavery. Well, if most of the people who move to the territory have slaves, then it's going to be a slave state. In response, anti-slavery Northerners, abolitionists, but just people who are really upset with the Kansas-Nebraska Act said, well, we're not going to let them get away with that. And therefore, in large numbers, people moved from the north to Kansas as well. And the way this worked out is, in one part of the state, you might have a pro-slavery community, and then maybe like 50 or 100 miles away, there might be an anti-slavery community as people from the different parts of the country tried to dig in and ultimately win what they're hoping is going to be sort of a demographic war. We want to have more of us than there are of you, so that when it comes time to decide what we're going to be, then we're going to win. Which, might be very American or whatever, but the feelings about this matter were so emotional, and both sides were so convinced that the other side was wrong and was wrong-headed, was evil, that Kansas, in the years following the Kansas-Nebraska Act, doesn't just turn out to be a place that people move to and hope that there's more of me than there are of you. They said, well, we're going to try to get rid of you. And Kansas, in the years after the Kansas-Nebraska Act, got the nickname Bleeding Kansas. As all eyes turn to Kansas, what's happening there is pro-slavery and anti-slavery people arrive in the territory, and then they literally fought for control of the territory. They fight with each other. They shoot at each other. They kill each other. People are dying over whether or not Kansas will become a slave state. It's in many ways a precursor to what's going to happen a decade later. And everybody in the country is watching this happen. Stephen Douglas, who is largely responsible for it with his very wrong-headed Kansas-Nebraska Act, can't believe what's happening here, this genie that he has uncorked, this Pandora's box that he has opened. The violence in Kansas really is very high level for a few years. It's ugly, ugly stuff. The country, in many ways, in the mid-1850s, seems like it's starting to fall apart. The Know-Nothings, they had their moments. The nativist feeling that they believed in doesn't go away. Instead, it largely transferred into the Republicans, as the Republicans turned out to be that alternate to the Democratic Party. The Republicans are mostly going to be the anti-Kansas-Nebraska Act, basically the Northern Party, and as we'll see, the party that is going to be the ones that is going to speak out against the expansion of slavery in the 1850s. They're going to take a little while, though. They just got started. Democrats, they sort of are the only show in town. They blew it with the Kansas-Nebraska Act. They left behind, in the years following, this legacy of kind of an open sore that in the middle of the country, the slavery issue is leading to incredible violence that is not really going to let up until it's time for the Civil War a few years down the road. The discussion for part 2 of tonight is how that crisis began to exacerbate and expand, and really a series of events that made the tension rise higher and higher and higher until finally, by the end of tonight, with our second lecture, people are going to be shooting at each other. The war will be on. All right, that'll be the topic of the second part, so take a break. I'm going to take a break, and we'll see you then. Thanks. Bye.